May 26, 1996, 16th Street and Georgetown Road on the west side of Indianapolis, Indiana. The same real estate that gave birth to the world's greatest racecourse back in 1909. The same place that has come to host the world's largest single-day sporting event. And the same event that's made names like Foyt, Unser, and Mears famous all over the world. But today, a new era begins at the Indianapolis 500. It's race day in Indianapolis.
The 1996 Indianapolis 500 was one of the most stunning races in the event's long history. The cars had never been faster, the drivers were inexperienced and obscure, and it was at the heart of the biggest political fight in American racing history. It was a dramatic, strange, tragic, exciting, anger-filled battleground race, the likes of which have never been seen before or since. Like a dark cloud hanging over it, the 1996 Indy 500 was the result of a political fight that had been brewing for years. It ended with IndyCar racing split into two separate bodies. The opposing sides were a collection of team owners making up CART, and Tony George leading the Indy Racing League. As the grandson of Indianapolis Motor Speedway owner Tony Holman, George was a part-time racer in the mid-1980s who worked in track management. At only 30 years old, he took over as track president in 1989. From the beginning, his relationship with the CART series was cold. In the 1960s, IndyCar racing was unified and strong. Indianapolis Motor Speedway owner Tony Holman worked closely with USAC, creating a strong connection between the Indy 500 and the entire season. Decades later, that would be only a memory. Like World War I created problems that led to World War II, the CART IRL war of the 1990s can be traced back to a split in the late 70s. After the death of Tony Holman in 1977, IndyCar racing was left without strong leadership. The people in charge of USAC were accused of mismanaging the series in many ways, most notably in their failure to attract money for the teams. Team owners left USAC and formed CART.
In the winter of 1978, car owners got together and decided they wanted to break away from USAC and form their own organization. USAC had been sanctioning IndyCar races since 1956. The reason for the meeting, the so-called Dan Gurney white paper, in which he listed several reasons why a new organization should be formed. For one thing, Gurney thought that IndyCar racing's full potential was not being realized.
We have a potentially huge international sport. For instance, with long-term rules that are set up to go 3 to 5 years, I'm sure we would get participation from foreign teams. The Porsche factory, possibly. The French Renault factory. They're all very interested in coming to the biggest race in the world on its own, but also they would go to the rest of the Indianapolis series, and it would just be a tremendous thing.
It was obvious that IndyCar racing could not support two groups. Both car owners and drivers were determined to show that the new kids on the block were unified.
I think one of the reasons we're getting such strong support from the drivers is the fact that we're interested in their input. They're starting to realize that they can go to CART with their problems and people are going to listen.
With the biggest names in racing on their side, CART quickly established dominance, and USAC lost the fight within 3 years. In an uneasy truce, USAC remained in charge of the Indy 500 because the Speedway refused to allow team owners to have too much control over the event. But this was a strange situation, where a year-long series didn't have control over its biggest event. It was as if the NFL didn't control the Super Bowl, or if NASCAR didn't control the Daytona 500. Neither the Indianapolis Speedway nor CART was happy with the situation. CART was organized as a somewhat democratic board of directors, where the team owners would make all the rule decisions. Despite their optimism at the beginning, CART's many problems couldn't be ignored by the late 80s.
In 1979, Championship Auto Racing Teams was formed when car owners felt the United States Auto Club wasn't listening to their problems. Now, 10 years later, the same thing seems to be happening.
Only a few of the most powerful team owners like Roger Penske, Pat Patrick, and Carl Haas were voting members on the board of directors. Small teams believed the big ones could protect their advantages by making rule changes that helped them.
One astute observer said that IndyCar racing today is like an ice show, with the stars being those few teams that win, all others members of the chorus. CART's have-nots will try to effect changes to make their lot better, while the CART haves will try to keep the status quo. We recall one CART founder more than a dozen years ago saying that in order to make this work, All we need are a lot of sponsors and some cars to pass. Well, they have the sponsors, but the cars to pass are getting fewer and fewer. Democratic racing organizations have never done well over the long run, but this isn't to say that one can't succeed.
Small teams felt the large ones were actively hurting them. Beyond owning a team, Roger Penske was co-owner of the Ilmor Engine Company that built the powerful Chevrolet motors. At the end of 1989, Penske was accused of convincing CART to change the rules in a manner that helped the Chevy engines and hurt their rivals. Not only did the Ilmor engine cost a lot, but they couldn't make enough to supply all the teams that wanted them. Penske could decide who got the engines and who didn't. Adding to that, the cost to compete was rising out of control.
There's an air of discontent in the IndyCar pits these days. Many CART car owners are concerned, even upset, over a wide range of issues. The ever-escalating cost of cars, engines, and parts is one bone of contention. Car owners generally agree now that to keep a car in the top 5 requires an annual budget of $5 million. Until Sunday, all races have been dominated by 3 teams, all of which use Chevy engines and are owned by CART directors. This all-dominant power plant is not generally available, which rankles the have-nots no end. Why should I pay to race when I know I can't win is the oft-asked question the Chevy policy raises. Repeated changes in engine and chassis rules, leading to increased costs, are said by owners to reflect poor management. Fewer and fewer cars are showing up for the races. At Sunday's Quaker State 500 at Pocono, only 26 cars went under the green flag, a far cry from the traditional 33 seen for years at 500-mile events. The CART board, car owners all, saw one of their members, Andy Kennepenske, quit in disgust recently, citing, among other things, a gag rule he says he's not comfortable with. And of the more emotional CART car owners, some say that between now and season's end, there could be an eruption on pit road.
CART leaders were losing control of their own paddock, but still looking to compete internationally with Formula One. In 1988, Pat Patrick said IndyCar should leave American tracks like Road America and compete internationally instead.
We need to get the series out of Elkhart Lake and out of Mid-Ohio and places where there's no market for the sponsor. We need to get world recognition. We need to be in Japan, we need to be in Europe, we need to be in South America, we need to be in Vancouver, Toronto, New York City.
At the same time, Formula One was concerned with CART as well. In 1990, the FIA considered creating an oval series to fight CART. Away from their international ambitions, IndyCar and the Indy 500 were split in almost every way. USAC controlled the rules for the Indy 500, and the rule package for the race didn't always match CART's rules for the entire season.
The owners will also be talking about this letter sent to them earlier this week by the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Vice President Tony George. In it, he scolds USAC and CART for not communicating on 1990 rules. It says, quote, if CART is serious about reorganization, and if they're serious about a governing body truly independent of political and financial interests, perhaps consideration should be made toward a common rules committee for USAC and CART. Now, many are saying that the Speedway is going to have to step forward and play a leadership role if IndyCar racing is to grow and prosper.
By the late 80s, CART leaders were provoking the Indianapolis Speedway with high levels of overconfidence. They were vocal in their belief that the Indy 500 was popular because of them, and not the other way around.
In my opinion, who exactly is the person who waves the flags or texts the cars necessarily isn't the key issue. It's the ability to work together for the good of everyone, because after all, we strengthen the Indianapolis 500 as a show. And the stronger we are, the stronger the Indianapolis 500 is. And as long as we keep that in mind, I think there's ways that we can work together for the benefit of both.
I cannot agree that a stronger CART makes for a stronger Indy 500. Everything in IndyCar racing is predicated on the Indy 500, including sponsorships. Now, the race has been around since 1911, and if they had to, the Speedway could go without a sanction. But I do agree we have to have that communication between the factions of USAC CART and the Indianapolis Motor Speedway.
Looking at the situation from the sidelines, the CART rank and file don't seem to understand that they're involved in a sport that exists for one reason, the Indianapolis 500. For without this race, the series would wither and die.
As the Indy 500 was clearly the most important race on the IndyCar schedule, Tony George wanted more input on the entire season. Unhappy with the expensive direction of the series, George called for new rules in 1991 that would eliminate turbochargers and lower the cost of engines and chassis. In November of that year, he presented a plan to restructure the CART board into a 7-member committee instead of 22 members. The restructuring plan was turned down. In 1992, he was added to the CART board, but only as a non-voting member. One of the biggest points of contention was George's belief that more races should be held on ovals. He pointed out that other open-wheel series around the world race on road courses. A series mostly on ovals would make IndyCar unique and stand out from everything else worldwide. You can't beat your competition if you do almost the same thing everyone else does.
So, I think oval racing is considered, Americana, and that's what we should, in my opinion, be trying to perfect and then export.
Furthermore, IndyCar didn't have a good development program to get new drivers. A lot came to IndyCar when their careers lost momentum in other series. They were getting the old Formula One drivers, and the drivers who couldn't even reach F1. Beyond their closer competition, more races on ovals would likely allow the driver development ladder to include American sprint car drivers too. This goal was personal for Tony George, whose father was Elmer George, a dirt racer who drove in 3 Indy 500s. The young man grew up with the idea that sprint car drivers like his father could work hard and someday race in the Indy 500. While legends like A.J. Foyt and Mario Andretti went from sprints to Indy back in the 60s, by the early 90s, almost every driver with that background was dismissed by IndyCar teams.
Langhorne, Springfield, Indianapolis, Syracuse, Sacramento, the 1-mile dirt tracks. This is the way IndyCar racing was until the early 1970s. To get there, you started in midgets, moved up to sprints, and then championship cars. Some of the drivers that began their careers in that way are still around, and the popularity and success of A.J. Foyt, Mario Andretti, and Johnny Rutherford may stem in part from their days on the dirt and their natural ability of driving a race car. But the road to Indy has changed.
I think the sprint car racer these days is pretty much phased out.
Between 1982 and 83, the number of IndyCar races on road courses jumped from 25% to nearly 50%. That has led to a new breed of IndyCar driver, those like Roberto Guerrero and Emerson Fittipaldi, whose experience is strictly on road courses. All of this seemed to create a division among fans and drivers.
What I see for the Indy, just a bunch of little rich kids that don't really race for a living. They just come into the thing and they buy a ride and they go fairly fast.
Two thoughts on it is, one thought is the closeness and the quick reactions you have to have running these cars in a tight group teaches you how to race and how to run traffic. But these cars, the difference is in these cars you're at the back of the car and you're the first one to know when the back end's going to get loose. In the speedway cars, you're at the front of the car, so you're the last one to know when the back end's going to get loose. So it takes a much finer feel.
The super modifieds, they have good power, but just doesn't get you the road racing experience that you need. Doing the midgets first is, it's a good way to start and all, but I think, once you get done with that, you got to move up into the formula cars and run the same circuits that the Indy cars are running.
Sprint car midget racing helps a lot when you're racing the Indy cars, like during the Indy 500, the race itself. But the practice and the qualification is it just means laps. You have to do a lot of practicing and getting a lot of laps to be able to know how the car feels to go well over 200, 215 miles an hour, actually.
And IndyCar was looking across the country as well. Down in Daytona, their stock car competitors were leaving them behind. By the early 80s, NASCAR was viewed as America's top form of auto racing. They had more races, more sponsors, had more support from manufacturers, and attracted more teams. And also, it cost less money to run a full season.
Car owners generally agree now that to keep a car in the top 5 requires an annual budget of $5 million.
Some teams obtaining as much as $2 million to complete the full schedule of Winston Cup events.
When NASCAR races were held at the same time as IndyCar races, NASCAR was televised live, and IndyCar was delayed. When tracks like Phoenix and Pocono held both series, the NASCAR races had far more spectators. Not only was NASCAR beating IndyCar in almost every category, in the early 90s, one driver in particular made it all worse. Even then, people knew this was the most talented driver in decades, and even compared him to Richard Petty. He was a symbol of IndyCar's failure to embrace talent.
Hi, I'm Jeff Gordon. I'm 13 years old and I'm running sprint cars. My long trip goal is really to get into IndyCar.
We're so accustomed to the old tradition when kids from Indiana got into sprint cars and midgets and their whole focus was spend their whole life trying to win the Indy 500. You're going a different direction. Why is that? And did you ever have any thoughts about Indy cars?
Oh yeah, you know, especially like you said, being down the road from the Indianapolis 500 track. I've gone to some races, and it wasn't that I was turned off by Indy cars. I enjoy Indy cars, and I looked at the ARS series, which I feel is a step to Indy cars, and then I looked at the Busch Grand National Series, which is a step to Winston Cup. And the opportunities were there with the stock cars, where they just didn't come along with the Indy cars. And
Jeff Gordon became America's most famous race car driver in the 90s, and he started out going up the IndyCar ladder. Traditional thinking said that sprint cars in Indiana should lead to the Indy 500. Instead, Gordon ended up in NASCAR and became their superstar.
I like Jeff Gordon. He's handsome.
Tony George understood a driver like Gordon would never be hired by an open-wheel team because, ironically, he had no road racing experience at the time. There were thousands of young drivers who raced on ovals, drivers with the potential to be national icons like Gordon, and every single one would go to NASCAR from that point forward. Road racers could adapt to ovals, but there was no expectation an oval driver could adapt to a road course.
I'm sad to see so many of our tremendous drivers ending up in NASCAR. It's a great series, and I go to all their races, but they don't need all of the best drivers. I'd like to see a few of them come to open wheel.
But despite its long list of problems in the late 80s, IndyCar was on the upswing by the mid-90s. It was a strong series that filled tracks with spectators and attracted some of the world's road racers like Emerson Fittipaldi, Nigel Mansell, and even Ayrton Senna, who tested once for Roger Penske and said he wanted to race in IndyCar after Formula One.
I might race anything, Indy or NASCAR, just for fun. It is going to be completely different for me.
By 1993, Ford returned to support IndyCar. Honda entered in 1994. More sponsorship was coming in, and the amount of entries per race was growing. But even that wasn't enough to put out the fire that was lit years before. Underneath the cigarette ads and aerodynamic bodies, there was a storm cloud on the horizon for IndyCar racing. The power was concentrated in the strong. The potential driver pool was limited, and there was the basic egotistical human nature that manifested itself in men who wanted control and wanted to prevent others from getting it. IndyCar needed a shakeup, but no one could have predicted how badly it would be shaken. The chain of events was set into motion in April 1993.
There will be a NASCAR Winston Cup stock car event here at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. The name of the event will be the Brickyard 400, and it will be a 400-mile, 160-lap race.
While the Brickyard 400 could be a great event by itself, it would also be a huge moneymaker for the track, and Tony George could use that extra money to fund his own IndyCar series if he wanted. It was speculated that Bill France Jr. encouraged George to take power in IndyCar. In NASCAR, the France family controlled the biggest event in the entire series, and it worked very well for them. On January 7, 1994, Andrew Craig was named president of CART. Later that day, Tony George resigned from the board of directors.
Whether you consider IndyCar strong or in need of an infusion of new blood and ideas, Craig's message has been well defined. Get the ship running leaner and more efficient.
I think what race fans want more than anything else is they want really good value for money. We've all been to races that are disappointing, where you felt pushed and shoved and watched a race that was boring and uninteresting. I think our primary responsibility to race fans is to give them top quality racing that represents great value for money, so they leave the track or on TV, leave the race and say, that was terrific.
Unquestionably, the most terrific show is the Indianapolis 500, sanctioned by USAC, run by Tony George, the Speedway's president. When Craig was hired, George resigned from the IndyCar board. But Craig won't let that develop into a schism between the two parties.
I know that Tony has some very clear views, and obviously I respect those views, some very clear views about the sport and how it should develop. I intend, if he so wishes, and I believe he does from what I've said to him, from the discussions we've had so far, I intend that he and I should have a very regular and very open dialogue.
On March 11, 1994, while teams were in Australia for the season-opening race, George made an announcement back in Indianapolis. Unless things changed, he would create his own series.
The Indianapolis Motor Speedway issued a press release saying that there is the possibility they will create a whole new IndyCar series within the next 2 years. The Speedway president, Tony George, indicates he is dissatisfied with the current course of IndyCar racing. All other details will come out after this year's Indianapolis 500.
Well, I don't know that that it'll actually be new in that, it'll be totally different from what we have today, but I think obviously I have some strong feelings that I would like one last chance at trying to impress upon the CART organization, see if we can't go forward together. But in the event that's not possible, then maybe an entirely new series with more of an American flavor would be the result.
From IndyCar's point of view, it wasn't entirely a surprise. Certainly over the last few months, and indeed last couple of years, there has been a growing gap, if you like, in the philosophy between ourselves and the philosophy of the Speedway. So from our point of view, while we were perhaps surprised by the timing of the announcement, the direction and the content of the announcement was something which perhaps we'd already anticipated. My intention is to meet with Tony at the earliest possible stage to discuss with him what the issues are, what his concerns are. And I know he has very sincerely held views on this issue. To meet with him and to see if we can find common ground between the parties.
At Indianapolis in May 1994, the uncertain future of IndyCar racing hung over the event. Meanwhile, Team Penske unveiled their new private Mercedes engine, nicknamed the Beast. It cost a lot to develop. Penske cars hit 250 miles per hour entering Turn 3 in practice, and the team dominated the race. There were two reactions to Penske's win. Some called it a tremendous feat of engineering. Others said it was Penske using his wealth and his personal engine company for a huge advantage. In early July, the future was confirmed. The new Indy Racing League would officially debut in 1996. IndyCar racing was split once again. In August, the IRL announced they would use non-turbocharged V8 engines that would keep costs down. CART would continue as an expensive series on mostly road courses, while the IRL was a cheaper series on ovals that encouraged the participation of American sprint car racers. If anything, the IRL was an attempt to copy some of what made NASCAR popular, strong American drivers on close, exciting ovals. That's what people wanted to see, or so they thought. What the split did was make the popularity gap between NASCAR and IndyCar even wider, as open-wheel racing began to devour itself.